invasive species. As globalization has proceeded, there's been, I guess you'd say, an exchange of living things in all directions. And so invasive species are a problem in many places. And a lot of federal agencies in the US are prioritizing this right now and spending billions of dollars. So unfortunately, I think the horses are just caught up in this moment. You know, meanings are always contextual and things change all the time. Right now, this happens to be a big priority for a lot of federal agencies. So Jen had mentioned that, you know, not all invasives are damaging, but the ones that are get a lot of attention and are causing a lot of problems. So things like the Burmese pythons in the Everglades, which is also Park Service. I read recently that the pythons have now killed over 95% of the mammals and birds in the Everglades. That's a huge problem. And there's things like the emerald ash borer, which is a little beetle from Asia that was first noted in the Great Lakes, I think in 2002. And now in 2023, they have killed almost every ash tree between the Great Lakes and Maine. And this is a big issue among native tribes in Maine because they rely on ash trees for a lot of traditional crafts. And they're working hard to try and save the last few ash trees and get on top of they're very much on the same wavelength with the federal agencies about getting rid of that beetle. So unfortunately for the horses, I mean, I'm hoping that a lot of the ideas that Jen mentioned will eventually make their way into the institutional culture of the National Park Service or be deployed by them. But in the short term, I think it's a better strategy probably to try and beat them at their own game with other science and, you know, maybe relying on watchdog organizations, the National Academy of Sciences, and groups like that that hold federal agencies to accountability for the accuracy of what they're asserting in terms of drawing interpretations from science. And I just want to here kind of mention one issue, and that is the genetics of the Theodore Roosevelt horses. So this could be an example of a possible alternative reading of scientific data, but I don't think it's going to be useful in the short term for what we're talking about, but it's an interesting example. So there have been a number of studies, genetic analyses of the horses in the park since 2018. There have also been genetic analyses of Nakota horses, and the results of these studies do not really synchronize. They're quite different in some respects, especially with regard to, you know, affinities to colonial Spanish or Iberian horse breeds. And I really can't speak to this either. I have no expertise in that. And I am just throwing that out there because if there's anybody here that is expert in genetics and could read like 4 different studies and explain the different results, I would really appreciate it. Now, I understand that it's difficult to specify, you know, breed affiliations because breeds are so closely related to one another. And also different labs have different libraries of genetic markers. So some labs don't even have genetic markers for some of the Spanish breeds. And so, but still, they seem very divergent. Anyway, moving on. I did want to say a few things about cultural and historic significance. And one thing, kind of banking off Jen again, is, you know, cultural significance and historic significance are not separate things. So sometimes I see people post things and it's like Native people have cultural significance, and then the state or the ranchers, there you want to talk about historical significance. But Native people and ranchers and the Park Service and the horses themselves all have both culture and history. And those are always in a dialectic relationship with one another. So speaking about the cultural significance of horses to Native people is a little something I don't really like to do, because I think Native people should articulate that themselves. But I do think that wild horses could be called culturally affirming for both Native people and ranchers. And there is an aspect in which history is a common theme, has influenced the significance they attribute to horses. So for Native people, we often hear about spiritual significance of horses and, the tremendous value they place on horses, part of which stems from their history with horses and their maybe glory days when they were independent equestrian bison hunters. And so that is now considered traditional life. And horses were extremely important part of that. But one thing people don't realize is that another factor coming into play is the way that Native people, especially on the plains, because that's where you had the military resistance to colonialism, the government, both civil and military, waged a long war against Native horses. So during the warfare period, during the middle of the 19th century, a policy was developed that after a battle with Native people, if the U.S. Army or the state militia won, so to speak, or was able to capture horses, that became a goal to capture the horses. And unfortunately, they then would shoot them. And that was to obviously disempower Native people so that they couldn't recover the horses. And it would restrict their mobility and their ability to hunt. And after the Little Bighorn fight, this was ratcheted up still more. So the hunting bands of Sitting Bull and his Confederates that went to Canada for 3.5 years before coming back, disarming and dismounting them became the major condition of their surrender. Not only that, but then the Army decided, well, we better also take the horses from and this is mainly Lakotas and Cheyennes, we better also take the horses from the people on the reservation, because they might be aiding and abetting them. They might go visit their relatives or whatever. So they took thousands of horses off the Cheyenne River, what's now Pine Ridge and Standing Rock. And then when the people came back and surrendered from Canada, they took their horses. And, this led to many lawsuits, which went on for decades, and Native people have never forgotten it. And it continued, because once they were forced to settle on reservations, the Office of Indian Affairs goal was to promote farming and ranching. And so they again took their horses to replace them with draft horses. And it continued beyond there. So when Fort Berthold Reservation was flooded in the 1950s to create the Garrison Dam, they again took their horses. So a lot of the people that I spoke with, I did field work at Fort Berthold too, but they identified with the horses almost as proxies for themselves, because they were glad that they would try to hide the horses from the BIA or the tribal police, because they liked that independence and their ability to elude being caught. And it's sort of the same with ranchers. There's a real element of that too. So the ranchers in the Medora area are seemingly kind of unique compared to studies that have been done in other communities that surround wild horse herds, because there was in the 80s anyway, tremendous support for the wild horses among the ranching community. And part of that is because they weren't competing with their livestock for grazing. But a big part of it too was that they are associated with sort of, the open range days and traditional ranching and cowboy culture. And they felt that they were part of them, that was an element of the Park Service that they related more to. And again, this involves sort of land taking and authoritarian control by federal agencies, because in the 1930s, the ranchers resented it when the government bought the land and then they had to start taking out permits to graze their livestock. They again resented it when the Park Service took over the land and they couldn't graze their livestock there at all. So again, they kind of rooted for the wild horses against the Park Service. So it's a combination of things. And again, if you read my article from North Dakota History, or my study, there are many, many examples of, long quotes from people that I interviewed about the significance of the horses. But one common theme is definitely, what the ranchers really liked was catching them and chasing them, because that was challenging to their riding and roping skills. And so they most frequently talked about the horses that they couldn't catch, like the gray stallions I talked about in my last, my talk for the Bully Pulpit rally. I talked about some individual horses in the history of the herd that people had called out to me or that I had experienced. And the ranchers all liked the ones they couldn't catch. But yeah, so I guess they often didn't really relate to the mission of the Park Service, but they related to the presence of the horses. And I find it really shocking that the Park Service is going to, the town of Medora relies on perpetuating this sort of Old West theme and ranching culture for tourism. And I'm really kind of astonished that the Park Service has announced that they're no longer going to talk about Theodore Roosevelt's legacy as a rancher, and therefore they don't need the horses because they're not going to interpret the open range ranching era anymore. They're now going to focus on natural history and restoration of, I guess, the prairie ecology. But it's kind of amazing that they're willing to just truncate that. The only thing I can think of is that, ranching, is not perfect either. And of course, many environmentalists would say that ranching is terrible for the planet. Maybe the Park Service just doesn't want to get into that dialogue. They don't want to cause more conflict with the local community. I don't know. But when I was reviewing my notes, I noticed another theme in often the ranchers would mention that they like to watch them. And I thought, and also another group that I got information from for the study is I administered a survey to previous Park Service employees at Theodore Roosevelt about their feelings about the horses and did they remember any, management events or anything else that they could provide information about with regard to the horse herd. And I was reviewing those recently too, and I had not remembered, and this kind of again gets back to Jen's talk about the Park Service. Actually, the vast majority of Park Service employees that responded to the survey, which included 4 previous superintendents, supported the presence of the horses, including 3 of the 4 superintendents. And I thought I just might finish by reading a couple of, yes, the horses were there before the park. And they acknowledged that in these surveys, the previous park employees. So first I'll read the comments of Art Sullivan, who's the superintendent that saved the horses. So for the first 20 years of Park Service administration, the goal was to eliminate all the horses, and they tried everything they could think of to capture and kill them. Fortunately, I guess Tom Tesher was front and center of many of those efforts, and he didn't want all the horses to disappear. So he would take a few out, but always make sure some stayed in. But Art Sullivan is the one that formally revised the policy. So this is what he said. Oh, and his years were, he was superintendent between March of 1966 and June of 1969. So he says, on my arrival at Theodore Roosevelt as superintendent, I soon learned that the park goal regarding these feral horses was total elimination. This was based on the rationale that the park was a natural area and feral horses were inappropriate. I disagreed with that goal. At that time, 1966, parks were administratively divided into 3 categories: natural, cultural, and recreational, with distinctive administrative policies for each category. Theodore Roosevelt National Memorial Park was designated a historical area, and NPS policies for historical areas provided for maintaining the historical scene. Feral horses were not new to the area, as Theodore Roosevelt himself mentioned them in writings about his adventures in the Badlands. Based upon these considerations, I reversed the park goal from one of elimination to protection of the feral horses as part of the historic scene. This was met with a strenuous resistance from the park ranger staff and even from the regional office. However, I did prevail as NPS policy supported this position. Interesting. The park ranger staff had already embarked on a program of surreptitious elimination of the horses. In at least one instance related to me, rangers shot a horse and passed it off as winter kill. They were at least sensitive to the inevitable public outcry were it known that rangers were shooting the horses. This action stopped upon my arrival. So John Lancaster was superintendent between October of 1972 and May of 79. And he says, the horses seem to fit within the mandate of a historic park. I still believe that even though Theodore Roosevelt National Park is now designated as a national park, one could still believe that the horses are important to telling the historic period of the Badlands. And then, let's see, some from people that were not superintendents, but chief rangers and the like. This person was, and it's interesting because a lot of these people served at Theodore Roosevelt in the early days, like 60s, when they were trying to eliminate all the horses, but many of them were supportive. So one person said he was there between 60 and 63. I think the horses are appropriate since the park commemorates the ranching activities of Theodore Roosevelt during the open range days. If you want to conserve the scenery enjoyed by TR, horses were a part of that scene. Just a couple more. This person was there between 56 and 57. So that's when the park was being fenced. The feeling prevalent among the park staff during my tenure at Theodore Roosevelt was that there had been feral horses in the Badlands at least as far back as Theodore Roosevelt's time, and that a few head were appropriate to the theme of the memorial park as it was then designated. It was commonly considered that about 20 head was an appropriate number, and that it was appropriate for local cowboys to catch a few if they could to keep the numbers fairly stable around 20. I tend to feel sympathetic to that theme and herd size. Yes, I do feel strongly that a few of the wild ones are appropriate. And then another person who was there between 75 and 78 says, yes, I feel that the herd should be maintained at about 35 to 70 head. It adds to the historical scene of the area and has the interest of a number of local people. Certainly, horses have as much place in the Badlands as the longhorns, buffalo, or elk. And then my final example is a person who actually was negative about the horses, and he was a local, not a park. Well, he did work for the park as a seasonal person, but he also lived in the area, and he wrote a lot of negative things. But then when asked, do you have strong feelings about the appropriateness of having feral horses in the park? If so, please describe. He said, I myself watch the wild horses as much or more as I do the buffalo herd. Again, this theme of watching the horses. And I did want to read one other, and that'll be my final comment. One of the local people, local ranchers said to me, people still come back here all the time and ask if there's any wild horses left. People would rather see a wild horse than a buffalo or any other animal. There's something different about a horse. I'm just struck by how many references people made when I went back and looked at some of the people I interviewed to how much they enjoyed watching the horses. And, you know, Tom enjoyed watching the horses. He would just go out and spend hours just watching the horses. And again, thinking of Jen's talk, and I'm so glad, Jen, if you ever watched this, that I was able to go after you and pick up on so many themes. But the idea that there's now a collective of photographers that travel around to observe and photograph wild horses, and the whole emergence of wildlife tourism and everything, the commonality is that all these people, the ranchers, some of the Park Service people, and people today really find it compelling to observe the herds and watch the herd dynamics. And of course, the internet facilitates that today. So you would think that the Park Service would want to satisfy that. And it bridges the generations. And I'm sorry, I can't be more encouraging. I have fought the Park Service since the late 1980s, and I have to admit I'm a bit jaded by it. But I'm still hopeful thanks to Chris. And now I'm happy to take any questions. Should we do that before you talk, Chris?
Can you talk about sorry, excuse me. Can you talk about being invited back to the park after your report was done?
Well, I don't believe they invited me back. I think I invited myself back, but they were very hospitable.
Can you
And
talk about that in about the stuff that we've been talking about with Superintendent Poe?
What about him?
The things that he has said and the things that you shared in the documents. And I don't know if you have any other thoughts or feelings about, I don't know, just the things that we've shared over the last couple of days.
Well, you can choose what and speak about those that you feel are significant, and I'm happy to comment on them. I've just given examples that 3 out of the 4 superintendents that were there in the 60s and 70s supported the horses. Noel Poe essentially supported the horses, maybe not enthusiastically, but at the time, I did not think he was very supportive of the horses. Only now, of course, in contrast to the current regime, he seems like a staunch advocate. But I just asked the Park Service if I could come back and update my, records based on what had happened since I worked there. And they said yes. And they put me up in park housing, and they gave me free access to their file cabinets.
Well, thank goodness. I know that, I don't know if you have a thought about, the one letter that where it talks about, because this is so contradictory to what happened now, and this is something Patrick Beers has asked, like, the key component about the new TRMP, she hopes to continue the park's facility revitalization plan to improve the visitor centers and parking options. So isn't it more about the personality and history of the person in charge of TRMP? And I think that that's something that's consistent through history, right? I mean, it's whatever the superintendent felt personally about the horses seemed to.
Yes, in the old days, that was the case. Park superintendents were given a lot of discretion for management decisions. But as I talked about kind of at length in one of my previous talks, I don't think that's the case now. I think this we're seeing this happen throughout the country. And I think it relates to larger mission shifts in the Park Service and the focus on prairie restoration and the emphasis on bison and so forth. And as I described, the current war against what are defined as invasive species by all federal agencies. So I don't think this is coming from the local park. I think the superintendent and staff there are charged with carrying it out. The other thing is, many people at the park have wanted to get rid of the horses for a long time. And I think they see this as the perfect moment because of the funds they're getting for bison and prairie restoration, and because of the Theodore Roosevelt Library coming to Medora, which they say will compensate for any loss of tourism by disaffected horse advocates. I think it's a confluence of forces, but I don't think it's initiated. I think there's been a sentiment in the park for a while moving towards this, and some of it is based on just the cost of managing the horses. And I don't mean just financially, but the constant controversies and the scrutiny that they're under from people. They have expressed in the past a resentment of that and the fact that they would prefer to focus on other priorities. So I think it's kind of a culmination of a disaffection that's been growing for maybe 15 years now, and combined with these larger mission shifts that kind of shared by many federal agencies today.
I also want to point out that Superintendent Richmond was not here when this process was initiated in March of 2022. She came shortly afterwards, but we also know from the American Wild Horse Campaign FOIA documents that they received that in 2020 it was talked about a lot, that they needed to get a wild horse management plan. So I don't feel like she's completely innocent, and she's definitely not making any friends here in North Dakota, but she is not the person who made this decision, and she's carrying out, I think, um, like you said, plans that were made before her arrival. So, um, but one thing that was interesting, there was a lot interesting to me in the documents that you shared, and thank you again for that. But one thing was that in 1998, and so Poe, you had said you thought that he was at the park for like 10 or 15 years as a superintendent, which is
Maybe
pretty,
10. I really don't remember, Chris.
but it's that's a pretty long time. And he may have been one of the longest running superintendents of the park. Did you say that? I think.
Well, in my time.
Okay. Um, but so he got there, I looked it up today. He got there in 95. So in 98, he wrote the one letter that you shared with us that says that he's been looking for funding for a management plan for all the large ungulates, the bison, the elk, and the horses, and their efforts had been unsuccessful. But it seemed like in light of not getting the funding for a management plan, it seems like with the documents that you've shared that he was trying to put together some kind of management of the horses anyway. Um,
Yes. Yeah, when I reread his correspondence with me, as well as the horse discussion document he wrote, he looks like a very progressive horse advocate, in contrast to where we are now, because he was proposing a whole slew of things. Like, for one thing, he emphasized public input. We need to get public input on how we manage the horses, what kind of horses we should manage, because during my time, and really kind of since then, the big controversy for me and many other people was the fact that they removed a lot of the original horses and replaced them with domestic horses. And he questioned that. Should we be doing that? And he proposed holding a symposium and bringing in experts from a variety of perspectives, to help suggest where to go in a horse management plan. So he was kind of all in, like, if we're going to have them, then we should be doing this right.
Right, and he does mention in here Dr. Gus Catherine, who also has weighed in on the horses here, and I did put a link to that in our blog today. He did weigh in on this current situation too, and kind of caution about what's happening. So that's also, I guess, my question for you, and this is maybe something that we don't know, um, really, but it seems like if this was happening in 1998, why can't that happen now?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? But again, I was struck with regard to Cawthron. Poe actually raised the herd numbers.
Right,
So he was listening to people.
right,
He consulted with Cawthron and with Phil Spangenberg on, the genetics and the phenotypic traits of the horses, and also what should be the minimum number we have for genetic diversity. And he upped the level
right.
based on their recommendations. So yeah, it's very different from today. Why it can't be, I don't know. I have shared with Chris that I feel like, there's these revolving doors that I keep opening, and every time I open a door, like a clown comes out and punches me in the face. Um, I don't know where this is coming from, why they are so determined, but they are.
He also said in here too, which I think is another key, there is not one document that they're referencing to manage the horses. So now we know in 1998, they didn't seem to care about the 1978 EA at all. And
Right.
he actually talked about that in the document where they went through the significant events of horses in that whole timeline. And he talks about Milton Fry and what he said, and how he spoke out against what was happening. So if we weren't caring in 1998 about what happened in 1978, then why are we in 2023 is also
Well,
mind-boggling.
as you know, I've been questioning that all along, because when I did the management history and in all the subsequent years, I was never impressed with the idea that, oh, we're managing according to this 1978 EA, because
Right,
in fact, the policy has evolved tremendously since then. That 1978 EA only talks about herd reduction and population levels. That's how narrowly they were conceiving of
right.
management. Since then, things have evolved a lot. So I personally don't understand how they keep saying that if we keep any horses, we have to default back to the 78 management plan and reinstate helicopter roundups and go back to those numbers, which I think it was like 30 to 45 or something. I don't
35
understand
to
that.
60. I
What
guess I'm
really, can
just,
I just say what infuriates me the most? And my letter to the park is on this theme. I know that this is a bureaucratic trick that's as old as the book, but what really infuriates me is that how this was a foregone conclusion. And this whole process seems to me just to have been a charade. And I would love to nail them on that.
I know that we all feel the same way. And I know that I just got our draft letter from our lawyers, and that is brought up in our letter to them also. As well as something else too that I will talk about here, and people can also feel free to include this in your comments. When the park is talking about a no action alternative, that means that nothing should change, right? There are a lot more than 35 to 60 horses in the park, and the park has actually never met that number. So any action that they're proposing creates a change. So they essentially do not have a no action alternative that they're giving us. That makes sense? The no action alternatives going back to the 1978 EA, which says 35 to 60 horses. Well, there's almost 200 horses in the park right now. That requires action. So it's just another challenge. There isn't, they really have not given us a no action alternative. Because no action means you leave the park the way that it is right now. None of their actions do that. Does that make sense? Did I confuse you? So here's another, Christina Anderson said, I think there's a significant timeline difference between wild horses and other species currently labeled as invasive. The beetle, python, and even starling bird species have been introduced in our generation, whereas wild horses, if considered reintroduced, have been here 500 plus years before many of our ancestors. I would think this would be a significant. Our generation's reintroduction of wolves are Canadian, yet we accept them as a native species.
Yes, I totally agree. And that's why I loved that phrase. Was it naturalized wildlife that they came up with at Sable Island?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just giving the examples of the deleterious invasive species because that is what the agencies are focusing on right now. And as I said, I think the horses are just caught up in that in this moment.
And then Joanne, you mentioned this already. Joanne said, weren't the horses there before the park, so they should be kept as a natural ecologists in this new position? Yeah, we agree that the horses were there. The horses are actually the only large ungulates that were in the park before the park existed. They brought everything else in. They brought bison in, they brought elk in, they brought bighorn sheep in, they brought pronghorn back in. So so the horses, that's where the native debate really, I think, gets heightened, because what is native then? The bison in this park aren't native to the area. They came here in the 50s. You know, the elk came, I think, in the 70s, the bighorn sheep, all of them. So
Yeah, the
I know.
horses have been in the Badlands since at least the 1880s, as far as documentation goes, but there's a lot of historical context and evidence that suggests they were there well before the 1880s. I mean, George Catlin and other Europeans that visited what's now North Dakota in the earlier 19th century wrote about the presence of wild horses in the area, but we know they were in the Little Missouri Badlands when Roosevelt got there. And he's one of many of the open range ranchers that mentioned them.
So
Everyone mentioned them, you know, for
right,
decades,
right.
you know, on into the 40s and 50s. And there were many big roundups. It's a pretty rich history of their presence.
Christina Anderson says, do you think that this is a campaign by the Department of the Interior to possibly give BLM a new platform or argument in their management of federally protected herds and branding them as livestock? Although these MPS horses are not protected, but Congress did say all free roaming and unbranded on public lands are wild. I think that you can talk about this because you did talk about it in your report, and people ask about why the Park Service is not included in the Wild Horse and Burro Act. So do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Well, the short answer is because they went to court immediately and won an exemption. Then the argument is that their mission is very different from the BLM and the Forest Service and other agencies. So, and they have historically from the beginning had a strict policy against what they consider to be exotic species. even in Theodore Roosevelt, there's an exotic species that's caused tremendous damage, and that's the leafy spurge. And they've spent millions of dollars trying to eradicate that. And that actually depletes the grazing potential, because it takes over the grasslands and animals don't eat it. So it's just a mission difference is really what it amounts to. But there was something else in that comment or question that I thought you were going to pick up on, and now I don't remember what it was.
Is it to give the BLM a new platform or
Yeah,
argument in their management? I do think that as this process is going on, and I know wild horse advocate friends that I've made on this journey and our legal team um, have often said the things that the park is doing is almost like a page out of a BLM handbook, but they're all under the Department of the Interior. I mean, so it makes sense, that they have some similarities in things that they're doing. I don't know. There's a couple things and we talked about this with Jen too. To our knowledge, there's not a concerted effort to remove the 1,000 wild horses that are on National Park Service lands. But like Jen also said, are the horses at Assateague safe? Nobody can say that for certain when you're looking at what's happening here in McCullough Peaks, and even the Priors that came under attack this past year. I believe that got put on hold, but it doesn't seem like any herd anywhere is safe, no matter who's managing them. There's issues
yeah.
with the Forest Service, the BLM. So yeah,
When the fires are threatened, something's afoot.
right.
And I will say, though, that it doesn't help that the Secretary of Interior has openly commented that she is against wild horses on public lands.
Right. She's been a disappointment to wild horse advocates, I know. And that's that could be a whole nother horse talk in itself. I don't know if if you can answer this. Joanne wants to know, where is the science stating that the horses actually help grasslands? And I think actually Craig Downer talked about that when we had our horse talk with him. I know he talked a little bit about that, and it is being proven. There's like a whole fire brigade now of wild horses and how they're helping the ecosystems. So there is a lot of that. And then the National Academy of Sciences also put out a report that we have on our website that's specific to wild horses and um, ways to help the BLM. It was really written to help the BLM with a path forward on managing wild horses. And of course, no one's listening to that either. So,
well, I have a corollary question. Where's the evidence that the horses in the park are damaging the environment?
that's another good question, because in our lawyers also raised that in our comment letter, that there's a lot of, I guess you would say, like fluff, right? Like the park has said, like the horses might damage archaeological sites, but we know from that 2022 document that they actually know the bison are damaging archaeological sites. So they don't give any proof, and there's no way to prove that the horses are doing anything that, like Milton Fry said, they're not doing any more damage than the elk, the bison, the deer, or any other large ungulates are doing. So it's not, there's nothing that anyone can pin right onto the horses, but the park wants us to believe that that is. So
They haven't offered any compelling evidence.
correct, but they just want us to. I go back to that 2022 document, right? They were just connecting the dots. We weren't supposed to ask questions. We were just supposed to listen to what they said and what they told us and go, oh, okay, I guess we have to get rid of the horses and then move on with our lives. And thankfully, there's a lot of people that are not doing that.
Well, Chris, I feel I should ask you to say something about what lies ahead, what you forecast will happen next, after people submit their comments by Friday at 11:59.
There's a couple people that asked a couple things. So let me just, Margot wants to know, would it serve a purpose to propose or even note in our comment letter using posed management ideas, as it is a more recent updated plan? I think absolutely, there's no reason not to. It shows that the things that we're asking for can be done if the park is willing to do them. So it's not a matter, like I was thinking when I was writing my blog post today, um, can and can't, would and wouldn't, we can't do that, right? But could you? Is it a possibility? And I think that the letters that you have from Poe, all those documents that we have show that, yeah, it is possible. You're telling us that it's not. He even said in there, I think, they didn't it say something to the effect of they managed the horses because it was within National Park Service policy. Well, if it was within policy when he was there, I don't know that a whole lot of policies have been created since 1998 that are, that if he was doing such a bad job and violating so many policies, he wouldn't have been superintendent for 10 years, right? I mean, somebody would have came down on him. So I think that that's a great point, and something that's what I was alluding to in our post today, that these are things that you can use in your comment letter, and it's things to challenge them. The park's not answering any questions. We know that, whether it's in their civic engagement, whether you put it on the portal, and they've said, if you have questions, that's a great question for your comment letter. Okay, well, I'm sure they're not going to answer it, but go ahead and ask.
Again, the lack of civic engagement is so
No,
disturbing to me.
I know.
They
And
refuse to meet with anyone and have a discussion in person. And
well,
they have
I've even gone to
limited,
the Medora
yeah,
City Council meetings. And if nothing else, and I've said this at the Medora City Council meeting, and I know that they did reach out to the park. Um, if they don't want to talk to me personally, I mean, it's still wrong. It's our federal government, but they absolutely should be talking to the town of Medora. And I told the people at the city council meeting, if they have not talked to you about the impacts, the possible impacts on what they're doing, then there's a director's order that says they're supposed to be. And I do know that members of the Medora City Council reached out to the park, and they're getting the same answers that everybody else is. So they're not talking to them anymore. And that's just, it's seems to me to be a violation of Director's Order 75A that talks all about civic engagement. And you know, fixing controversies and in different things that are actually happening here, instead of, just we're doing this because. And our lawyers made a point of that too, and there are court cases that show that a federal agency cannot just say we're doing this because we said so. And that's exactly what the park is doing, and that's
oh,
all that they're giving us.
well, that's hopeful because that seems it would be grounds for appeal. I mean, in my letter, I'm saying I think the whole thing's been disingenuous and that they should be forced to repeat it in a more sincere way.
Right. And then Christina said the NPS in their reference list has a wild horses history that goes back historically to the mid 1500s, stating that Native American tribes had horses before ever seeing a white man. All this was documented by a French Canadian. That seems like that's up your alley.
Yeah, no, I'm not on the native horse side of things. I believe horses evolved here, became extinct, and were reintroduced by the Spanish, and that's been supported by a number of recent studies, including one that showed that all modern horse breeds in the US have some Iberian genetic heritage. So the French Canadian probably saw early horses on the northern plains. But anyway, the Park Service is not going to debate the merits of that argument either.
Right.
So
And then,
nothing substantive is being debated here, in other words.
right.
It's pretty much just an arbitrary exercise of power, which is so frustrating
I know.
because people have put their hearts and souls into writing these long, thoughtful, well-documented comments to the park, and it's just outrageous that it's just, I'm sure they just toss them over their shoulder.
Well, I know that, and I know we're going to add to it, but our comment letter, we got our draft comment letter from the lawyers, and with our new supporting documentation, so, and this isn't any of the old stuff that we've already sent, I think that our full comment letter will be about 150 pages, with supporting documentation, new supporting documentation. I think it's over 30 pages of written comment, and then, over 100 pages of supporting documentation. So we're doing everything we can. And obviously, I made the decision. I wrote our first comment letter last March. And our lawyers tweaked it and polished it based on what I did. But I made the decision this time to have them write the letter because I want to make sure that our I's are dotted and our T's are crossed, because you can see where this is going. I know that there's a lot of frustration, a lot of irritation, and we share that. I'm exhausted. Today was a long day for me. And it's going to be a long week. I can already see that. But this fight is not over on Friday. That's a big thing that everybody has to know. The fate of these horses is not decided on Friday. The fate of these horses is decided when we have fought everything that we fought, and there's nothing more that we can do. I shared with Castle, I was talking to an AP reporter today, and hopefully they're going to be putting something out this week just to remind people to comment. And he asked me, are you hopeful that the horses will stay? And I said, I'm very hopeful that we will win. But if there's a long fight, I am not hopeful that the park will willingly do the right thing and allow the horses to stay. That I don't think. And I hope I'm wrong. I mean, if I could be wrong about anything, I hope I'm wrong about that. But what happens now is, first of all, everybody needs to comment by Friday. I want to just reiterate too, this is not about the number of comments. So some people are telling me they're commenting every day. That's not what we're asking people to do. What I actually asked people to do was just take your thoughts, open a Word document, and just as you get new thoughts, maybe Castle shared something today, and that's something you want to include in your letter. Maybe Jen shared something. Maybe anyone, anywhere that you've heard something, just kind of jot those things down and write your letter. We've been sharing different things that you can say, resources that you can use on our website, and just compile one letter and send it into the park. We're not looking for 1 million or 2 million or 20,000 people to comment, because if everybody's just saying, I'm not coming back to the park if you eliminate the horses, that's one comment. Is there any substance to that? Not really. That's not helping save this herd. So we do have a form letter on our website. I'm asking again. I know some people are going to just copy and paste it and put it into the comments. I can't help that. But I'm asking you to personalize it. Do something to make it personal. Because again, the clicker will go off, right? We received the comment for everyone who copies and pastes that. But essentially what the park's going to do is look for unique comments. And so last time they had just under 20,000 comments, and that got reduced to, I think it was like 5,000 or 7,000 when they looked at unique comments. And so that's really what they're looking for too. They're looking for something with substance to say, this is what we think you should do instead. This is what should be happening instead. This is where I'm challenging the economic aspect. Your Brownlee study said 49%, it's actually 89%. You haven't shown us that there won't be any impact on tourism. So those are things that you can use in saying, again, I've gone through this and I feel like I've talked it to death on our website. So please just make sure you have until 11:59 p.m. on Friday to submit your comment to the park. You can also have it postmarked on Friday, but remember, it's also Black Friday. Thursday's also Thanksgiving, so it's kind of a hectic week. So you can postmark your stuff by the 24th, so they don't have to receive it by that day. That's very important. It just has to be postmarked by that day. They will probably be back in a couple months and let us know how many people commented, and then just kind of give a report, which I do want to say is nice, I think, of them. You kind of get a report and some examples of comments that people have shared. And they do have that from the last comment period on their park planning website also. So it's just nice to see the different organizations that weigh in. And really the people who are coming to bat for these horses is incredible. And I'm going to tell you, whatever is happening here will absolutely set a precedent. And we've been talking about that for a long time. What's happening here is the rallying and support for the horses is one thing. The politicians, the Stockmen's Association, American Wild Horse Campaign, Oregon Wild Horse Organization. I mean, anywhere and everywhere throughout the world, people are coming together to rally for these horses, and that's great. And it's showing the power of us to elevate our voice to that level. So once they're done with that, and they should be going through all the comments, and then they will decide, will there be any impact on the decision that we're making to eliminate the horses? So they've already said numerous times that there will be and they say throughout the EA too, minimal to no impact on the horses in the park, and removing the horses from the park. So they should come back then with a FONSI, it's called, finding of no significant impact. We're hoping that they come back and say, you know, we need to look at this a little bit further to see if there will be an impact, and do an environmental impact statement, which will take them years to finish, which is why they don't want to do it. I told the AP reporter again today that when they come back in the spring, whichever way that, whatever way their decision goes, our lawyers will advise us on what our next legal moves could be, or give us legal advice on what we can and can't do and what seems feasible. I'm not going to threaten lawsuits. We have never threatened lawsuits or litigation, but our organization, Chasing Horses Wild Horse Advocates, is willing to take this as far as we have to make sure those horses stay exactly where they are, so that my grandkids and your grandkids can walk into the park the same way that we are right now and see these wild horses. So I hope that helps answer that. I think this is one of my wild horse advocate friends who's been doing this for a long time has said, we're just in the start of a very long fight. So I know it seems pressing because the comment period ends on Friday, but really this is just the beginning of a long fight. So I need everyone more than anything to buckle your seatbelts and be in for the long haul of this ride. Margot wants to know, can we use our previous comment letter even in part? Yes, you can. You don't have to create a new one. Our lawyers actually started with our last comment letter because they haven't answered those things, correct? Like they've dismissed any of the alternatives that would allow for any horses to stay. And if you still want them to do that, we even said you should still be challenging the livestock classification. We believe that they have never properly classified these horses, and we believe that because we have repeatedly asked them for documentation on the classification of these horses, and since they don't give them to us under the Freedom of Information Act, we're going to guess it doesn't exist. So pick a topic from the EA, research and comment. Don't try to cover all the areas in the EA. It's overwhelming and time consuming. I agree, Christina. I've said this all along. Castle is an expert on the historical aspect of this. I'm not going to try to write a comment letter the way that Castle is writing a letter. That's for Castle and other people to do. I know Steve Martins was on this call here today too. He's writing a wonderful letter that talks about the history of that. Those are the people who are fighting that. If you aren't a lawyer, a scientist, a historian, don't try to be one now for this comment period. Write the letter to the best of your ability. And I think that our template shows that, where you can pick points, give some substance to it, and not have to try to it's not as hard as you think, but you don't have to try to be a scientist when you're not one. So when you list in your comment letter a reference, research, give that proof. I can tell you anything that we have listed on our website, we are sending those documents in. So like the National Academy of Sciences document, they have that. This correspondence from Superintendent Poe, they will have that. If you want to send it as well, you're welcome to. But you can also send us a message and I'll let you know if we have that. Like I said, the first comment period, we submitted, I think it was like a 15-pound box full of documentation. This time we're going to be sending probably almost 200 pages of documentation. So if you want to know if you need to send that, you can send us a message. What I cannot do, and I'm getting a lot of this, and I really apologize, I cannot read everyone's comment letter and give you pointers on what you should do. I'm trying to wade through our comment letter and get that finished. I will say, and I've said this before, we've done our best to give everybody as much education as we can on this topic. And I believe that if you go through our website, our blogs, watch the horse talks we've had with so many great people, I think that you have all the tools you need to be an educated advocate and really write a strong comment letter, whether it's a paragraph or 20 pages. You have the tools, and we've given that to you. So I hope that helps. So do, do you have anything to add, Castle?
Chris, I hope that you can at least take a spa day or something at some point. Hey, Patrick Beers, thanks for being here, everyone. I really appreciate everyone being here and everyone sending comments. And again, I most of all appreciate Chris's leadership on this. She's just been outstanding. And
Thank you. That means a lot coming from you, especially. I just want to make sure that these horses stay right where they are. I do want to also let everyone know that like 3 minutes beforehand, Castle and I were here and the recording started for the Zoom, and Castle was like, "Oh no, it's recording." And I said, "That's fine, I'll just chop it off." And then 15 minutes into your talk, I happened to look up and the recording was paused. So I don't know when that happened, but I did hit record at like 15 minutes. So good for all of you for being here. You got to see the whole thing. It might have paused for a minute, it might have for 10. I don't know what happened. So I'll know when I go through, but I always say that sharing this on social media is at the hands of the technology gods. And, all I can do is pray, right? So, so thank you everyone for being here. Have a very, very happy Thanksgiving, but please don't forget to send your comments into the park. And thank you so much, Castle. I appreciate not only all of the history that you have given us and all the research that